we introduced Rick Spinrad, is his colleague, a former colleague, our own Bill Cosso, who is the guest director. Bill was working at NOAA with Rick, and his last posting was he was the Deputy AA, Associate Administrator for National Ocean Service. And so he knows Rick quite well, and I requested him to come and introduce me. So Bill Cosso.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be brief and quick. On behalf of Goddard, thank you, Rick, for joining us. Today is an extraordinarily busy day. The NOAA administrator is down in New Orleans right now, and she's about to tell the country about the upcoming hurricane season starting next Monday officially, even though Anna already came and went to North Carolina. So I'm sure demands on your time, especially today, are really great. So thank you again for coming, and I look forward to an extraordinary story about how you got to where you are.
Thanks, Bill. That's the kind of intro I like. I want to talk to you, when I read about the Maniac Talks and the background on them, this was an exciting opportunity to try to blend in a little bit of personal history and try to send some messages about what I think are important aspects of what might delicately be called a diversified career. The messages having to do with respect for transdisciplinary studies, the messages having to do with respecting different sectors' approach to science and technology. And I thought I'd do it mostly by referencing places and people. So you're not going to see a single formula. You're not going to see a single graph of data. I will talk about some of the specific technological and scientific issues that I was involved with, but I'm not going to bore you with the details of my own studies in radiative transfer. And I thought I'd start by saying I am in my early 60s, and I've been an oceanographer for 50 years. How can you do that? Well, in fact, it started here in this architecturally superb building called Junior High School 104, Simon Brook High School on 21st Street and 1st Avenue in New York City, where I was fortunate in the 8th grade to have a teacher, his name was Paul Rabinowitz, who taught an earth sciences curriculum. And remember, this was about the same time that Jacques Cousteau was doing his thing. We had a variety of different media, TV, movies addressing things oceanographic. And what Paul Rabinowitz did in this junior high school was he gave us each an assignment in this earth sciences class to develop a project around oceanography or geology or atmospheric sciences. And I said, I'm going to build a depth sounder. So how old was I? Probably about 13 years old, right? I'm going to build a depth sounder. And the really cool thing about Paul Rabinowitz was he never said, no, tone it down. You're not going to build a depth sounder. He said, fine. And he pointed me to this place called Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory from Columbia, and he actually put me in touch with some grad students. And I had it all figured out. I got a 6-volt dry cell. I got a little transmitter from a toy Morse code kit that I had. And I had a microphone receiver and a stopwatch. Now, when you get right down to it, that's all you really need, right? And I lived on the east side in New York in Manhattan, and so down around 20th Street, so I figured I could just go out to the pier on the East River, take this dry cell and effectively a pinger and a microphone and my stopwatch. The part I hadn't quite figured out was sound velocity in water is about 1.5 kilometers per second, water depth of, maybe 10, 15 feet. I would need the accuracy in my stopwatch of a couple of milliseconds to get the depth right. So that's where the experiment failed. But I was hooked. I was absolutely intrigued with the idea. And the point is that Paul Rabinowitz was a smart enough and good enough teacher not to squelch that kind of curiosity. And at that point, I was so hooked that my poor dad, who was a businessman who traveled around the country, was enlisted on my behalf to collect water samples everywhere he went. And he ended up, you know, he'd go to California, and I don't know, he probably took him out of the tap at the hotel where he was. But he'd come back, and my experiment was to boil the water down to see what the residue looked like. So I'd already had physical oceanography and chemical oceanography in my background at that point. I was hooked. The next thing that happened, and I really have to thank the National Science Foundation, I got into high school. I was at a school called Stuyvesant High School in New York, which was a specialty science and technology school. And the National Science Foundation put out a program where they said you could spend up to 6 weeks at a set of universities around the country and study in particular areas. And I happened to get in the program that allowed me to go to Oregon State University for 6 weeks as a sophomore in high school. This is what the Oregon State University complex in Newport, Oregon looked like about that time, late 60s. And I had the opportunity to spend 2 weeks on atmospheric sciences, 2 weeks on geology, and 2 weeks on oceanography. And as it turned out, the crowd at Oregon State was getting ready to start a cruise in the eastern tropical Pacific. And they asked me if I wanted to help. Are you kidding? A high school student, did I want to help? Now, I wasn't ever going to spend a day at sea on that, but what I was going to do was prep the gear and check the lists and order equipment. It was the most fascinating experience that I'd ever been involved with, and I had no idea what I was ordering or what we were doing, but I got the sense of, if you will, the challenges just getting a research cruise put together, and that started to get me hooked. So I was already hooked on how much we didn't know about the ocean. I was already hooked on the challenges of sensor development, and now I was hooked on the challenges associated with data acquisition. I ended up then going to Johns Hopkins for my undergrad. And this is where the story gets a little bit weird. My dad was a journalist. My mom was, worked for the Navy as a translator in the Second World War. The point is, neither of them was technologically oriented. I said I really wanted to get into oceanography, and so we started looking to see who had undergraduate oceanography programs. There were only really 2 or 3. McGill had one, University of Washington had one, and Johns Hopkins had a program where you could get a BA, it's not a mistake, a BA in Earth and Planetary Sciences. And I said, man, that's for me, absolutely. And I went in and I studied with Francis Bretherton was my major professor. Now, those of you in the field know Francis Bretherton is kind of an icon. As far as I was concerned, he was the guy who just signed off on my course requests every year. I was too dumb to even realize the quality of the education I was getting. But what I did realize after 4 years at Hopkins, when I walked out with my freshly minted Bachelor of Arts in Earth and Planetary Sciences, was that I had a really good broad education in physics of the ocean, geology of the ocean, chemistry, mathematics, good broad education. And then I wanted to go to grad school. Very interested in physical oceanography at that point. And I met this guy. Guy is J. Ronald V. Zanneveld, Ron Zanneveld, professor at Oregon State University who had followed his major professor, who had left MIT, went to Oregon State University to work on physics of the ocean, and within a year or two, unfortunately took his own life, leaving Ron having to rewrite his PhD dissertation in 1 month because nobody was willing to pick up what he had written for his previous advisor. So just give you some sense. Ron's a brilliant man. He's also a very accomplished artist. This picture in the background is one that Ron had done. He did a lot of seascapes. And Ron was working in the field of ocean optics. So here I was. I had this degree from Johns Hopkins. I thought I was hot stuff. I got into the physical oceanography program at Oregon State with a bunch of grad students who had studied physics. Their degrees were in physics, BSs in physics, or math. And I was eating their dust. There was no way I could keep up with that group. But the interesting thing was this guy, Ron Zanneveld, said, don't worry about that, because what we're doing is not traditional physical oceanography, geophysical fluid dynamics. What we're working on is radiative transfer. You ever heard of that? I said, no. He said, well, let's start looking into this. How does light penetrate the sea? What are the impacts of particles and dissolved materials on the sea? And I was hooked. I was as hooked on that subject as I had been in building an echo sounder some 7 to 10 years before that. And Ron Zanneveld, to this day, Ron is still running around doing a variety of different things in optical oceanography. And this was really when a lot of the concepts about visible remote sensing were starting to churn along, and a lot of the ideas about how might we be able to characterize the nature of the oceans, the nature of the stuff in the oceans using optical techniques. So I was a grad student. That's me. That's how I supplemented my graduate research assistantship all over the world, I might add. I taught banjo in Corvallis, Oregon, and obviously I had more hair then on my way down to Peru. Ron was also really good at, I guess we used to say Shanghaiing graduate students. He'd walk into the lab and he'd say, "Who wants to go to Peru?" "Yeah, I want to go to Peru. Sounds great." Okay, that was the good part of the deal. The bad part of the deal was we're leaving in February from Newport on an 85-foot ship. That's we. I'm leaving from Newport. So I spent a lot of time at sea. This is obviously not the 85-footer. This was on the Yaquina, one of Oregon State's older vessels, sister ship of the USS Pueblo, incidentally. And went down to Peru and actually bussed in the bars in Peru, made some money that way. But more importantly, I was the first person at that point ever to characterize in the transect going from Oregon down to Peru, but the variability in the inherent optical properties of the upper ocean were. Nobody had ever looked at that. And it was really kind of fun to be involved in the pioneering days of characterizing the optical variability. There had been researchers, mostly in Denmark and other parts of Europe, who had developed theories and characterized water types, water classification, but nobody had really developed the technology for assessing what that water type looked like. And that's what we were doing. We were, in conjunction with programs like the Current Upwelling Ecosystem Analysis, QUEA program, we were demonstrating technologies that would allow us to characterize the nature, the magnitude, the geography of coastal upwelling using techniques that had never been developed before. We were using the optical techniques. And it turned out that this technology, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail in a minute, was so effective that we started using it for characterizing features like the high-energy benthic boundary layers here on the east coast of the US, where we could start looking at how much water, how much mass, suspended material, was moving through the ocean system just by looking at the optical properties. And it's more than just traditional sort of nephelometry. We were actually quantitatively quantifying, characterizing. So we could take these techniques, and instead of just saying there's a lot of crud moving from this part of the ocean to that, we could quantify it in terms of total suspended mass. And as we got better and better with spectral analysis, literally the optical spectrum, we could start talking about what components within that suspended material were contributing to how much of the signal we were seeing. Part of that development came from these two individuals, Charlie and Clarice Jentsch. Now, they had been at a variety of oceanographic institutions when Charlie, clearly one of the main iconoclasts in the oceanographic community, said, that's it, he's tired of academia, he's going to start his own lab. So he started a place called Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences in Maine. Charlie was the first person to recognize that we could quantify chlorophyll fluorescence in a way that not only worked in the laboratory for taking samples, filtering them, figuring out how much biomass was in the water, but actually served as the foundational understanding for a lot of the coastal zone color scanner, CWIFS technology that developed in subsequent years. And so Charlie was, in my career, one of the first people I'd seen who truly understood the transdisciplinary nature of the ocean. He was trained as a biologist, but he could go at it with physical oceanographers like anybody else, and he understood how the biology and the physics interacted. So at that point I realized maybe that degree in Earth and Planetary Sciences, which gave me a broad but shallow training, wasn't so bad after all. Because I found now that I could relate to a lot of what Charlie was talking about in ways that my colleagues who had been strictly trained in the physics of geophysical fluid dynamics were not as well prepared. Charlie turned out to be a really strong influence in my career in that way. Now, Clarice, also trained as a biologist, She's still alive. He passed away about 3 years ago. Clarice had a very interesting approach to understanding ecosystem dynamics. And her basic approach was, we're very limited with our analytical techniques in the marine biological community. What else is out there? And she started mixing it up with the biomedical community. And it turns out that the biomedical community had this tool, this capability for analyzing individual cells, blood cells, cancer cells, in a conducting medium, like blood. It's called flow cytometry. Clarice said, wait a minute, how big are these cells? Oh, tens of microns. Same size as most marine phytoplankton. And the conducting medium that we have, of course, is seawater. So why couldn't we use flow cytometry, which had been used as a clinical diagnostic tool in the medical community, to start analyzing marine microorganisms? It's a brilliant idea. So Clarice was instrumental in convincing the National Science Foundation to go out and get one of these things. And at Bigelow Lab, they started the first work in analyzing the individual cells. So in the past, we'd been looking at the biology or the physics or the optics of whole collections, aggregates of cells, mixtures of cells. Now what Clarice demonstrated was we could one by one analyze these cells for fluorescence and therefore chlorophyll concentration. That's when I started working at Bigelow, and I said, boy, if we could do that, why couldn't we do the same thing with the optics? And in that sense, as an optical oceanographer, the fundamental thing you learn is that the parameters that affect the attenuation, the scattering, and the absorption are the size, shape, and refractive index of the particles. But those all get mixed up in aggregate. But now we had a technique for actually looking at the individual particle size, shape, refractive index. Sidebar point on this was we had this huge flow cytometer. Back then, flow cytometer took probably half the width of this room. It was a huge laser-based instrument for measuring the scattering, the absorption, the fluorescence, the time of flight of a particle with a laser-impinged flow orthogonal to each other. And my problem was I wanted to calibrate it for refractive index, but I wanted to calibrate it for refractive index close to that of water, and I want to calibrate it for refractive index materials close to that of water and also in a size distribution. You go through the determination, and it turns out that hydrocarbons are really good because they don't dissolve. You can actually take hydrocarbons, put them in seawater, basically shake them up, and what you get is a size distribution of small globules, each of which is spherical, and they have a uniform refractive index, right? Perfect theory. Problem is, the hydrocarbons were heptane, octane, nonane, gasoline. So I took concentrations of gasoline, put them through a high-powered laser, and needless to say, we were all on fire alert when we did that. But we were able to demonstrate really a cool technique for characterizing, for calibrating flow cytometry, for now quantifying the refractive index, size, and shape of marine particles. That took me back to the instrumentation thing. So I worked at Bigelow for a few years. Meanwhile, my buddies back at Oregon State had taken this idea for transmissometry, where we were using a collimated LED, a 632 nanometer LED. Back then, that's all you could get, was a 632 nanometer LED, a bright red LED. Now, of course, you can get the full spectrum. But a very narrow bandwidth, tough to collimate, so we had some marvelous engineers who figured out how to collimate over any path length that you wanted, 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters, a meter. And we developed this instrument, and then we realized there was a market for this. People wanted to know how much stuff was suspended in the water, whether it was water treatment plants or oceanographers or limnologists. So we started a company called CTEC. CTEC has evolved, and it was bought out by a company called Wet Labs. And any of you who have worked in the ocean sensing world have undoubtedly heard of Wet Labs. But for me, it was really an extraordinary experience to take now the physical oceanography, the biological oceanography, a little bit of chemistry, and tie it in with the engineering world. And I ended up being president of this company for a couple of years when we developed yet additional instruments, fluorometers, multispectral absorption meters, scattering meters, attenuation meters, And I'm delighted to point out that that company is now thriving. It's part of a large conglomerate selling these very instruments. But for me, it was a whole new experience. I didn't know anything about small business. And I spent 2 years working in that business. It wasn't a very pleasant experience. It's a small business, and we were struggling. We were getting SBIR grants. But as I look back years later, that experience now has been terrific. When I sit down and talk with an entrepreneur or a new business startup, say, I understand what you're doing, I understand the challenges. I learned a lot about market development. I learned a lot about production. I learned a lot about liabilities. Really a good experience. Mostly what I learned about, though, was the thirst for data regarding the optical variability of the ocean. A lot of that thirst came from the Navy. So, the Navy, now we're into the mid-'80s, if you've been following this sort of chronology. And in the mid-'80s, if you think about it, this was the time when Tom Clancy was putting out The Hunt for Red October. Non-acoustic anti-submarine warfare was the place to be. And non-acoustic meant a limited number of technologies: radar, optics, some chemistry. But now, as a member of the optical oceanographic community in the US, which numbered maybe 50 to 75 PhD scientists, I got connected with a lot of what Navy was doing. In fact, for a lot of my research, the Office of Naval Research was the sponsor. And this is just a characterization of what some of the problem was. Submarines operating at shallow depths in clear littoral waters can be visible to an airborne observer. There's all sorts of aspects of protection of the submarine force. There's aspects of communication. In fact, back then, DARPA and the Navy had two programs. They had a program named Project Lambda and a program named Project Y. And the reason they were called Lambda and Y, if you can envision a lambda and a Y in your mind, one was to study how lasers could be used to communicate down. Think of a Y, and the other was to see how lasers could be used to communicate up from a submarine. Think of a lambda. That was the whole basis for those programs. But what it meant was that we were in a place to start really driving a lot of new technology development. While I was at ONR, I went as a program manager, and over the course of 2 or 3 years, I was able to increase the program budget by almost 2 orders of magnitude. That was a different time. That was the height of the Cold War. The idea that we had a threat that could be mitigated by the use of this kind of technology was very heady stuff. And it was really the boom years, the golden years for a lot of the oceanographic community, but certainly the optical community. Toward the end of that period, though, some funny things started happening. So as part of my job at ONR, and now I was getting into this program management piece of my career, we realized that in terms of technology, the United States had maybe not the leading edge, but certainly had advantage in certain areas. A lot of the top researchers were US researchers. But by far and away, the largest optical oceanographic workforce was in the then Soviet Union. And by our estimates and intelligence estimates, the workforce in the Soviet Union working on optical oceanography was about 600 to 800 PhD scientists. One of whom was this guy, Kuzyel Schifrin. And the story I'm about to tell you, for me, is one of the most fascinating stories that I never would have expected when I joined ONR. So in about 1990, I'm sitting at my desk over in Ballston in Virginia at ONR, and I get a phone call. And the other end of the line, it's a scratchy voice, and the voice says, "Is Spinrad?" I said, "Yeah, this is Rick Spinrad." And I was sure it was Tom Nelson, a Navy commander who worked on the 6th floor, who loved pulling practical jokes on everyone. So I was kind of cherry at first. And he said, "Is Kuzyel Schifrin?" And my ears perked up, because Tom, Commander Nelson, would not have known who Kuzyel Schifrin was. I knew who Kuzyel Schifrin was. Kuzyel Schifrin was arguably one of the top 5 optical oceanographers in the Soviet Union, calling me from basically Stalingrad. And then he said, "I want out." Whoa! It's a long story I'd be glad to tell you over a beer, but the short version of it is, he had decided, he was seeing what was happening with the wall coming down, the end of the Soviet Union. He still felt, he was in his early 70s then in very poor health, but he still felt that he could come out and contribute, and that if there was an opportunity in the United States, he would love to come over, basically defect. So using telexes as our communications means, and for those of you under 40, I'd be glad to share with you what a telex is at some point. We communicated, and then I went to talk to our special security officer at the Office of Naval Research, and I said, Ed, what do I do about this? And he said, bring him out of the country. But you can't go in. You can't go into the Soviet Union. So we arranged to meet in Helsinki. And this was like a scene out of Dr. Zhivago. This is the Helsinki train station. You can imagine a big old churning steam locomotive coming in. And I agreed to meet him. I got to Helsinki, and this was all done under the premise of my having to be in Finland for a scientific conference. And it came to the time where I had to pick him up. And all I had was older pictures of Schifrin. I thought I knew what he might look like. But I decided to do what everybody does when you meet somebody at a train station or an airport. I made a little cardboard sign. This is where the other part of a diverse education comes in. I'd had one term of Russian at Johns Hopkins, just because I like languages. And I remembered enough of the Cyrillic alphabet that I could spell Schifrin phonetically. So I took my little card and I wrote Schifrin on it. I felt really proud of myself. Then I said, wait a minute. Schifrin could be like Smith. There could be a dozen Schifrins on that plane. And granted, most of them won't be over 70, but how am I going to know I got the right guy? And then I thought, he's an optical oceanographer. I'm an optical oceanographer. There's a famous equation in optical oceanography that describes the decay of irradiance in the sea called the Gershon equation of radiative transfer. Differential equation. So under the Cyrillic Schifrin, I wrote the Gershon equation for radiative transfer. And I had that sign, and I'm standing there at the train station, and this little old man walks up with his cane, and he looks at me, and he goes, Gershon equation. I said, you're my man, come with me. We ended up taking Kusiel, and we had several places where we could have him hosted. And they were all academic institutions. There were really 4 institutions that were working actively in optical oceanography. One was University of Miami, the Erasmus School. We thought, this guy spent 72 years in the Soviet Union. I'm not sure he's ready for Miami Beach. Another was Texas A&M. Had similar thoughts about him showing up in Texas. The third was Scripps down in La Jolla. And for a variety of reasons, that wasn't going to work out. And the fourth was Oregon State. Remember Ron Zaneveld on the previous slide? Ron said I'd be delighted and honored to have Kusiel come in and work with us. And the end of this story is that Kusiel worked at Oregon State for probably about 10 years. He passed away 4 or 5 years ago. I contributed to a biography of his that was subsequently published. And I love it because I've got the page marked. It's all in Russian, of course. And I love the page that has the Gershon equation, which tells me they got the story right in there. But anyway, it also opened my eyes to a number of issues of a policy nature and started to get into some real questions about how the international community was working. And I had the interesting experience at that point. Now we're into 1994. I was back at my job at ONR. It was a plum of a job. It's a wonderful organization. I had an SES job. I was doing great. And it turned out that there was an organization called the Joint Oceanographic Institutions whose primary job was to run the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program for the National Science Foundation. The director of Joint Oceanographic Institutions, JOI, was a guy named Jim Baker. The Clinton administration called Jim Baker and said, come on over and be the NOAA administrator. And Jim went over and was a NOAA administrator. And JOI was left without a director. Now, JOI had the opportunity to not only manage programs, but separately be a lobby, if you will, an advocacy group. But Jim Baker had always been a little bit chary about doing that. And the board of directors of the Joint Oceanographic Institutions basically looked around to see who'd be interested in this. And this guy pops up. Now, you may recognize that picture. That's Admiral James D. Watkins, 4-star admiral, former chief of naval operations, the highest ranking admiral in the Navy in the mid-'80s. He had also been George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Energy, which is where you might know him. He had also been the very first AIDS czar when the AIDS Commission was set up in the late 80s. Well, it turned out that Jim Watkins, a submariner in the US Navy, had a passion for things oceanographic. He was retired, he'd done his stint in the cabinet, he'd done his stint in the Navy. This job popped up and he thought, yeah, I'd like to do this, maybe I can advocate some. So they ended up hiring Jim Watkins as the president of Corps. And what Watkins did at that point was said, we need to think how we're working this oceanographic community. We need to see what's going on. So he started very cleverly calling around to the agencies, talking to various people in NASA, Navy, NOAA, NSF, USGS, to talk about the oceanographic community. And I wasn't aware of all this. Like I said, I was happy in my job at ONR, actively involved in research development, sending money out, listening to scientists all over the world. I got a phone call one day, could I come meet with Admiral Watkins? I said, what's this about? Well, he's just getting information on what's going on in the community. I said, sure. So I went downtown. And I sat down with him. And those of you who hadn't never met Watkins, he was an imposing fellow. Probably 6'4", big frame guy. Not your typical submariner, just in terms of shape and size. And I sat down and kind of felt like I was back in elementary school being grilled, because he was asking a lot of tough questions. But I had back at ONR. I didn't care. And I told him what I thought of his ideas, of what his priorities were, what the community was up to. Never thought twice about it and figured that was nice. Got to meet the guy, which was a real honor. Back to my office, and the next day he calls and says, would you like a job? Leave the government, leave the SES to go work for this guy. Well, let me take a look at who else has worked for this guy. And when I looked at the people who had worked for and with Watkins, it's a list of very well-accomplished people, men and women who went on to have great careers in policy and science. And I thought, that's a risk, but I think I'll try it. So I went to work for Jim Watkins for 5 years as his executive director. He ended up being instrumental in any number of things. If you've heard of the National Ocean Partnership Program, Watkins led that. He basically wrote the legislation. If you've heard of the National Ocean Sciences Bowl, that was a Watkins invention. He made CORE, the Consortium for Oceanographic Research and Education. What had been a small group with 10 members was now close to 100 members, including industry, museums, and was an effective spokesperson, as you can see here, and was chosen then by both the Clinton administration and the George W. Bush administration to lead the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy. We'd never had a commission like this before, a National Commission on Ocean Policy. He led that around 2001, 2002. Well, it would have been 2001 because it started the day after George W. Bush was inaugurated, and put out some of the most seminal statements about where the nation needs to go in terms of ocean policy. I had never expected to get into the policy world. Before this, I was into the science and technology. I was into the management of the science. I was into development of instrumentation. I was into some of the strategic development. I was involved with a lot of the professional societies. Never thought I would be writing testimony, much less giving testimony on the Hill. I had been taught, in fact, as a scientist to stay as far away from that kind of thing as possible. But this opened my eyes, and working for somebody like Watkins was an absolutely phenomenal experience. I worked for him for 5 years, went back to Navy on the operational side, and worked for the oceanographer of the Navy. Had a number of wonderful bosses there, including people like Jerry Ellis and Dick West, some of whom you may know. And while I was working there, a former naval officer named Conrad Lautenbacher became the NOAA administrator. And it turned out that the National Ocean Service, one of the line offices at NOAA, needed a director, needed an assistant administrator. Lautenbacher and I had known each other, and he asked me to apply for that job. I thought, not sure I want to go to work for NOAA. I'm a Navy guy. We were kind of elitist. But the opportunity to go be in a leadership position in a technologically oriented organization like the National Ocean Service was really intriguing. So I went to work for NOAA back in 2003, and I headed up the National Ocean Service. I wasn't there a year when, as happens about every 10 years at NOAA, Congress really took a laser sight on NOAA's research and said, there's problems there. You really need to look into that. You really need to study it. We think you ought to either get rid of NOAA research or revamp it completely. So what Admiral Lautenbacher did was he said, well, wait a minute, let me put a team together that will review that NOAA research program, look at our laboratories in Boulder and Miami and Seattle and everywhere else, and figure out what needs to be done. So Lautenbacher contacted Berrien Moore, and again, I'm sure many in the audience know Berrien. At that point, he was at the University of New Hampshire, preeminent climate scientist. He's down at Oklahoma right now. He also brought in the guy who was running NOAA research at that point, Rick Rose, and then a few other folks, including Warren Washington, Dick West, retired naval officer. And then Lautenbacher said to me, Rick, you're the head of NOS, why don't you, and you haven't been here at NOAA long enough to have drunk the Kool-Aid, why don't you join this particular team as well? I said, yeah, sure, fine, glad to do it. And we deliberated for close to 2 years, and then put out a set of recommendations on how to revamp NOAA research. Memo to self: if you're ever on an internal committee designated by the administrator, be prepared to be on the receiving end of whatever recommendation you make. So no sooner had we put these recommendations forward than Lautenbacher calls me up and says, great recommendations, how would you like to run NOAA research? And this is what I quickly realized was not a volunteer option for me. And so actually it was intriguing enough, and I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. So that in 2005, I ended up running NOAA research. And this is where things started getting interesting, because I had the benefit of that transdisciplinary experience. I had the benefit of understanding small business. I had the benefit through my career of being able to see policy work. What I hadn't really done, though, was use that background to dive into some of the critical issues. So I said, great, I'm the head of NOAA research. I'm going to find out what we're doing in every area. And so I ended up saying, next time we have a hurricane, let me know. I'll fly down to Tampa. I'll do some penetrations on the P3s. Let me know what's going on in submarine research, because I want to go diving on the Johnson Sea Link and some of the other vessels. I abused my position of authority to understand fully what was going on in each of these areas. And this is, in fact, one of the hurricane penetrations we did in Hurricane Ike on the P3s. Real thrill. We had 8 penetrations on that particular flight. We were testing out some new radars. Really gives you a sense for, once again, the challenges that we have in the oceanographic and atmospheric sciences community. And when I was at ONR, we used to always get in the debate, because ONR is broad, it deals with the full spectrum of sciences. And we'd watch the program managers in materials, solid state physics, some of the biological fields, talk about their field experiments, which for them was a chip. You know, basically their experiment to go from breadboard to brass board might take a year. And the argument we would constantly make is everything takes 2 to 3 times longer in the environmental field, because just collecting enough data may require 2 hurricane seasons, or you may have to be around to capture one La Nina, El Nino cycle. And so it's going to take longer. And oh, by the way, it's a lot harder. And I used to have this debate with a lot of my spaceflight colleagues about the difficulty of collecting data in the ocean, where you cannot transmit RF, where you're operating in the dark, where you're operating at 10,000 PSI. It's a different kind of environment. And so just experiencing what the research community was doing with some of the new technologies was a real thrill that, like I say, I was able to abuse in this capacity. I also happened to be the head of OAR in 2004 when the tsunami earthquake hit, right after Christmas. And you talk about a wake-up call for an agency like NOAA, where previously we had some smatterings of research going on in places like Seattle at the Pacific Marine Environmental Lab, but the 250,000 deaths as a result of that earthquake were the kind of thing that dictated a major campaign of activity. And I ended up then spending time in Banda Aceh, seeing some of the damage there, and got involved with our Indonesian, yeah, that's me there in a typical formal Indonesian outfit. In fact, when I met the ambassador the next day, he said, "Didn't take long for you to go native, did it?" So But it was very important to develop some of that international collaboration. I remember thinking at times like this, how did I get here? A kid from New York who was interested in oceanography, who went through the sort of traditional career spectrum, and now here I am on the fantail of a ship talking with the Ministry of whatever it was in that particular dialogue about taking new concepts, new technologies. These are what we call the DART buoys for deep ocean assessment of tsunamis, and affecting not just programs, but now policy and international relations. And it was really a wonderful opportunity that I thought was only possible by virtue of the luck that I'd had and those intersections that I'd had with some critical people. And the last piece of this story is, I finished my stint at NOAA in 2010. I was eligible to retire. I retired. I got a great job as the VP for research at Oregon State University. I could go to academia. I could grow a ponytail. Well, sort of. I could grow a ponytail. I could wear coats with leather patches. That I could do. And I did that. I went to Oregon State for 4 years, and everything was fine. My wife, a native Oregonian, was delighted that we were back in Oregon. And then this woman popped into my life, back into my life, Kathy Sullivan. Many of you know Kathy, I assume. Kathy is an astronaut. She's the first American woman to walk in space, did 3 shuttle flights. Very accomplished, very down to earth, very humble. One of Kathy's favorite phrases that I like is she got her best press release anybody could ever get at age 26. And very action oriented. And Kathy had called me and basically said, we have the opportunity to bring a chief scientist in to NOAA. There hadn't been one at NOAA in 18 years, and the last one was Kathy Sullivan. For a variety of reasons, politics, the climate of the Congress, previous administrators had not been able to bring in a chief scientist. But there was an opportunity for me to come in. So a year and a half ago, Kathy and I started talking, and I said, I'm very interested. I think experience in the several agencies, basically 4 different federal agencies. I think I know the oceanographic and atmospheric sciences community, that I can contribute something by virtue of all these experiences. I'd love to come. I'd love to do that. So I started back in NOAA on the 1st of July. I'm here through the end of this administration, which means there's a clock ticking. If we're going to do anything, we've got until the end of this administration. And there's no better motivator than saying, you know, you turn into a pumpkin here at a certain time. So we're trying to do a lot right now in organizing NOAA's research portfolio. This is a direct quote from Kathy that's driving my mission. We're looking at how we are affecting more realistic transitions from research to operations. And oh, by the way, those of you in the audience who have worked with NOAA, and I know many of you have over the years, we are trying to build a more transparent, more justifiable, clearer process and machinery for transitioning the really cool developments happening at places like Goddard into the operational context for NOAA's mission. And that's what's embedded in that quote from Kathy. And so I'm just having a blast doing that. And you know, I go back and say, some of you may have noticed the quote from my talk came from the Grateful Dead. Some of you may not know who the Grateful Dead are. But it really has been a long, strange trip. But I wouldn't have changed a single thing. And I attribute so much of the great experience that I've had to the people and the places and the luck that I had in being in the right place at the right time. So I will conclude there. Be glad to take any questions that you've got, and just simply say thank you to all of you for your attention and inviting me to come speak today. Thank you.
Yes, Lee can take a few questions or comments if you have one.
I have a question. I'm just interested in what you choose. If you thought through this period of time that you talked about, just limited to perhaps sort of your professional activities or anything else, what would you think would be the best day that you ever had?
Wow, the best day that I ever had. So, best can take a couple of definitions.
Your choice.
Yeah, I mean, flying through the hurricane was the best day in many respects because, one, I had no idea what to expect. It's a curiosity that I think everybody has. Don't you want to know what it looks like at 5,000 to 8,000 feet to fly through the eye wall? By the same token, the first and only time that I drove a ballistic missile nuclear submarine, and I did. Granted, there was a guy right behind me as I was on the planes. That was a pretty thrilling experience. So I think there's a collection of these in-the-field experiences that I've had. Like any scientist early in my career, my master's thesis was on Mie scattering, which is very near-forward scattering of particles. And when I was able to get the first data that started showing that the theory that Gustav Mie had developed in 1908 could, for the first time, be validated with observations, that was thrilling. That was really thrilling. So best, to me, there are a whole bunch of best days. That day that I met with Admiral Watkins was a best day, because if I had known that was a job interview, I probably would have frozen, and I probably would have thought, well, what does he want to hear from me? But because I didn't know I was being interviewed for a job, I had a great time talking. How often do you get to talk to cabinet member, former CNO, about what you think should happen in the community? And it was just phenomenal. So, and of course, the day I got married.
I wasn't thinking back as far as, long time ago. It's just interesting. They were action-oriented, and it was involved new vision.
Most often it was about people, people that I got involved with, and I was lucky. I mean, I was lucky to have gotten involved with some great leaders. I was lucky, in retrospect, to have worked for some really crummy leaders, too. And you learn a lot from some of them. But clearly, the people that I showed, every one of the individuals I showed on this slide, including Schifrin, taught me a lot. It sounds trite, but it's very meaningful to me. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes?
As the NOAA Chief Scientist, can you or are you allowed to talk about any changes that you plan to make at NOAA? Can you give like an example, or are you not allowed to?
Yeah, no, I certainly can. The question is whether I will actually be effective in doing that. So I'll give one very specific example and ties into the transition. So the issue of transition from research into operations applications, it's a problem that every agency, every scientific endeavor has. How do you take the really good ideas, demonstrate them scientifically, harden them into an operational context, and then start using them regularly in operations? When I was at Navy, we had a well-established process for doing that. In fact, the Navy appropriation is set up so that you've got funds of money for the basic research, funds of money for the operations, and funds of money to use the transition of the research into operations. At NOAA, we don't have that. We basically have two kinds of money. And so we don't have a structure for rigorously transitioning from research into operations. If you develop a really good hurricane model, and you are working at a laboratory or a university, when, how, and why should we take that model and say, that's better than what we've currently got, let's put it into the Hurricane Center as the standard model for our forecast guidance. So building a structure for doing that, and a process for doing that, and giving responsibility to people for coming up with the ideas and vetting them and reviewing them. If I can leave NOAA having developed that and built that in a way that the career workforce says that works much better than what we've done before, let's operate that way forever, then that will, I think, be a very helpful contribution. And you've got a number of former NOAA folks here in the audience who understand completely the need to do that sort of thing in the agency. That's one example. There's some other things. We're trying to fix our cooperative institutes so that they're a little bit better structured. Does that get to your question? Good.
Rick, I'm Steve Holt.
Hi, Steve.
Probably been familiar with years with NOAA.
Yep.
Over 30 years. I just want to raise an issue. I know that years ago we were at a Marine Technology Society IEEE Oceans Conference in Seattle, and we had a GEOS meeting, an all-day workshop.
Yeah.
I think you were there, and then Zdenko Willis. And
Yep.
we had a presentation. I think it was Bob Weller.
Mm-hmm. Woods Hole.
It was on establishing an ocean observing systems community of practice.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I don't think it ever got off the ground at the time, but I know that other places like LinkedIn have system engineering,
Yep.
the community of practice and stuff. Does NOAA ever, do you think someday NOAA would ever go and have something like for ocean scientists and oceanographers around the world to have like a community of practice where everyone can go and communicate that way?
Yeah, I think, Steve, that we will, but I think it'll come about a different way rather than pushing, if you will, from the technical side. Most of the communities of practice that I'm aware of are pulled into that by the need, the community need, the societal need, the operational need. So if you think about on the weather side, for example, where there are communities of practice, maybe not as formally defined as such, but you can look at National Weather Association as a community of practice, if you will. That happened because people said we need certain products, we need certain services, we need to be able to identify our requirements and then pull them from the community. We need to tell the researchers what we think they ought to be working on, if you will. On the ocean observation side, the problem we've had for years is that we've got a lot of good ideas about what the observation should be. We need to build that pull a little bit more. The Argo program with the nearly 4,000 floats out right now is an example of where I think we're starting to do that. If you recall when Argo was originally pitched 15, 20 years ago, people said, why do we want to have 3,000 floats out there measuring salinity, temperature, in the upper couple thousand meters and drifting around endlessly? And now when we're starting to look at, you know, global budgets of heat, momentum, energy, mass, they're saying we realize the value of having this observing system, and they're pulling the need. They're saying we need to, now we need deep Argo, you know, now we need other observational capabilities. So it's got to come from the user pull, if you will, to establish a community of practice, and that's been harder to do on the ocean side. If you think about weather radar, the NEXRAD system, the Doppler radars, that has developed because people said we see the value, we want to have that. We don't have to justify having a community of practice associated with weather radars. We don't have that yet on the ocean observation side, and that's where I think we need to go.
Last question.
There's currently a lot of overlap in the science that NOAA is doing and NASA. I was wondering if you have any ideas on how to optimize productivity and get NOAA and NASA to collaborate?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't take that as a given that there's overlap. I think that on face value, if you're working on you know, approaches to a new sensing capability, yes, we are doing that at NOAA. NASA is doing that as well. But I actually think through the dialogue that we have in the communities, there's a lot more collaboration than we necessarily agree to. Where I think the bigger between our two agencies exists is in an understanding of when a new idea, whether it's using microwave sensor for sea surface salinity, for example, is robust enough to build into an operational capability. And it's, NOAA has a responsibility both for continuity of observations and also for building out the operational portfolio that dictates a certain conservatism to how we approach it. NASA has a responsibility for identifying new approaches to observational capabilities, new sensor concepts, and how do you get those two things to meet? That's where I think the traditional debate, if you will, between the agencies exists, not in overlap of activities. That's my sense.
There are overlaps in creating data sets.
Yeah.
Did you have a quick one? Yeah.
Yeah, I do think the data issue is one that's getting a lot of good attention right now, and part of that is being driven by the big data challenges that places like the White House are dictating on all of us.
You had a quick one?
Yes. Thanks for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Get the reference to the Grateful Dead. I'm wondering, when discussions come up about the human influence on climate change, how do you couch your responses, or NOAA's responses to it?
Yeah, so I mean, part of the answer is that it's unequivocal. The evidence is there, and there's some relatively simple physics you can go through that, you know, by adding heat, you're adding energy, and there will be consequences associated with that. What I think, but as your question implies, there are factions of interest or disinterest in the issue that don't want to get into the, that are really upset by the attribution argument. And what's becoming much more effective right now, I find, is that the argument for addressing what is an unequivocal signal are coming from, no longer from the academics or the government scientists. Those are coming from local jurisdictions who are subject to more extensive nuisance flooding, changes in sea level, ocean acidification. They are seeing this. Industry's seeing it, local jurisdictions are seeing it. And they're basically saying, we don't really care what caused this so much. What we need to understand is what are the consequences and are there things that can be done to mitigate? And so it's a slightly nuanced response to that. But let's get past the attribution argument, which is at the heart of what the controversy is with your question, I think.
Okay, let's thank Rick one more time.
Thank you.